Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here at the third session of evidence taking for the all-party parliamentary group for devolution. I'm Andrew Lewis, chairman of the APPG, and I have a panel of very experienced and interested people in local government and devolution. The inquiry is looking at government, primarily central government, and how central government needs to change and what they need to address in order for greater devolution to be a reality. Just to let you all know that the session is being recorded, and we'll be tagging it with at APPG Devolution. We'd be grateful if any of you are appearing today could publicise the fact that you've done so and add that tag. People who are viewing the session, if they could remember to be muted and turn the camera off, it helps with the bandwidth of the broadcast and also just the focus. And I would like to invite our witnesses to introduce themselves after I've said their names. We have some questions and possibly some follow-up questions as well. So we'd like to start with the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. Andy, we're really delighted that you're here and with us. And if you'd like to open with I don't think you probably need to open by saying who you are. I think everybody knows that. But if you have a few comments and a few thoughts, we'll then go into some questions for your session. Andy.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. I think this year has brought over to everybody the limitations of trying to run everything in the old top-down way that we've always tried to do in this country. It's never a satisfactory way of doing things, but I think we've all seen this year how limiting it can be in a situation like this. Because in many ways, it would have been a much different response to the pandemic. I think if at the early days a decision had been taken to localise more of the response rather than to centralise it, I think it would have led to a greater sharing of the burden. I think it would have unlocked resource and expertise at a local level more, and probably would have taken pressure off the government and led to a better balance, I think, between government at local and regional level and at national level, and possibly less conflict actually between government at the different levels. You know, if you'd imagine a different scenario to this year where that decision was taken to localise and local testing teams weren't stood down in March as they were, and we built a test and trace system building up from the public health teams that we have already in local authorities across the country. I think you can see how the response would have been quite different to the one that we've had, where new systems were stood up at speed, commissioned at speed with all of the expense that comes with that. And we're seeing some of those reports in the media now. And I just think it would have been a safer way to go, but certainly a less expensive way to go. But it would have also led to the character of the response would have been different in that it would have been place-based. And I think it would have been more effective for being place-based. So just to give an example, Andrew, from what I'm trying to say, if you imagine a test, trace and isolate regime that was basically end-to-end managed by local teams on the ground, you can see how the way in which those teams would interact with the public would be very different to the centralised call centre based approach that we've ended up with, and all the complexity that comes with that when it then tries to interact with teams at a local level. If people were having one conversation on the doorstep with an individual who tested positive and then dealing with the contacts and the arrangements to isolate, I just think it would have been a much better response. So in some ways that is just an example that's very current in this year. But actually, you can read that across to public services more broadly. in times when we're not facing a pandemic. You know, I lead the city region that has a degree of health devolution, and we're the first to have that. But also, in my past, I have been health secretary, and sometimes I'm asked to describe the difference between those two roles. And what I always say is that as health secretary, it's possible to see numbers, not names. But as Mayor of Greater Manchester, it's possible to work with names, not numbers. And there is a world of difference between those two approaches, because by starting from the bottom up in a place-based way, I think you can join the dots and you can see the bigger picture of all the things that impacts on somebody's health and their mental health. Whereas in the Department of Health, you're sort of peering out from a sort of policy silo in SW1A with a telescope, trying to work out what's going on in all of these different places across the country. And not surprisingly, you get a very partial and a very disconnected view of what's happening in the real world. And that, I think, is the problem with the way we run our country. We over-centralise power in Whitehall. We allow the policy silos to deal with individual issues rather than seeing things in the round as they affect places. We have the sort of short-term thinking that goes on of ministers in position and they're out of position, and all the frustration that comes with agendas being started and changed. It's not an effective way of running things. And I'll finish on this point. You know, I certainly feel in my role quite liberated to be outside of that Whitehall and Westminster system. When you start with place, which is what you do in a role like the one I hold, you're starting with something that unifies people, because however people vote, they all care about the place. So it is something that naturally brings people together. At the other end, if you start with party, which often happens in the Westminster system, you're starting with something that is just naturally divisive and isn't going to bring sort of long-term consensus to some of the policy changes that you're making. So I would say we've hit a point here where the country needs major rebalancing, a new political settlement, devolution to the regions and nations. And I think the experience of this year, I think maybe now brings over the need for that to more people. As we look to the recovery, there is just no way that you can level up top down. So if the response couldn't be driven top down, well, the recovery absolutely cannot be driven top down. That has to be a bottom up endeavour. And I think, you know, the quicker we get on and empower places with the funding and the freedoms to be masters of their own destiny, we will ensure that the recovery from COVID is more energetic and more successful. I will leave it there, Andrew. Just a few observations on where we find ourselves today.
Great, well, thanks very much. And I think actually your opening comments have covered my question, which was to ask what you think the implications for English devolution are as a result of the COVID pandemic. I think we're covered on that, so I'll ask my colleague Scott Mann to ask you the next question.
Andrew, I have to be honest, I haven't looked at the agenda, so I'm going to ask my own question if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Andy, I represent an area in Cornwall which has a rather large unitary authority and a devolution settlement in a rural area with no mayor. So I'm just wondering how you envisage devolution working in areas like Cornwall, where we have that rurality, but also a sense of place.
Well, thanks, Scott. I really think it could work. I don't think the model that we have is unique to a city region context. I think, you know, what you certainly have in Cornwall, as far as I know, is huge sense of identity. Your own flag, even as far as I know, my last visit. I think the thing about devolution is obviously there's different ways in which it can be done, but it allows, by creating a mayoral role, it creates that central sort of position that can unify join the dots, break down the silos, and can be accountable. Because obviously, what I found coming into my role was just how much people were kind of grateful to have one person to complain to. So if you take something like public transport, commuters in Greater Manchester had kind of suffered really from a fragmented system over many years, unreliable, overpriced, things going wrong, services not joining up with each other. But who do they complain to? It was way too complicated. You know, there was a committee on transport for Greater Manchester, there was the deregulated bus companies, the train. Even though I don't have power over all of it, people still complain to me as if I do. And actually, you do have a degree of soft power to start to, you know, bang their heads together a little bit, which is what I've tried to do. And I just think the arrival of a mayor in any context, be that a rural, semi-rural, suburban, urban, just creates an ability. You create a force that can bring people together, get people around the same table, be a voice for the region that becomes recognisable, and can speak up for the region, and that gets then a kind of positive effect back on the residents, because they get a sense that the area is being heard and is punching its weight. So I think, it was obviously Conservative government, George Osborne, that created these roles. I think the devolution that Labour proposed when I was in government was the wrong, in retrospect, the wrong model. You know, the regional approach felt like a layer, an extra layer, and it felt bureaucratic. And the Northwest is not necessarily what people first affiliate to. They do affiliate to their sub-regions, if you like, or city regions. But from those kind of building blocks, Steve Rotherham and I do work very closely together, and we do get the kind of one Northwest voice coming through as well. So you can scale it up and down from this model. So in your context, you know, if you had a mayor of Cornwall, a mayor of Devon, I would imagine that there would be occasions where you would stand up together and make the case for the West of England. So I think it could work in any context, Scott. And I think the sooner that England has parity with regard to devolution deals, the more people will buy into devolution. The danger is leaving it half finished, is that people start to resent it as though some areas have got it, some haven't. So I think it absolutely can work. And arguably, it might mean rural areas get heard a lot more than they do and stop the cities dominating so much.
Thanks very much. So slight variation, but if Dorothy is going to interject now, and then we'll move on to Margaret after that. So Dorothy, your question.
Yeah, we'll do a bit of a swap, Scott, because I think you've articulated very well the model. You know, why I campaigned against mayors as a Lib Dem, but then became one and was a convert. So you've articulated. We
have something in common, Dorothy.
Yeah, and to be honest, I did with your colleagues, you know, Jules Pipe and others. But let's turn it on its other head then. If we can see those advantages, what in fact do you, from your working with government, particularly over COVID, what do you see as the biggest barriers? What's actually holding things back?
I think it's the Whitehall culture. They've had it their own way for far too long. And I think there is just an ingrained kind of resistance to the idea of places being more assertive. And this is way beyond any political party, by the way. It's absolutely the case of the way it was when, you know, the government I was in was way too London-centric. I've always said that. So I think it's the Whitehall culture, I would say, is the biggest problem. And I think to the extent that it's allowed devolution or bought into it, they see it still as begging bowl devolution, where we all have to know our place and we all have to sort of curry favour all of the time and, you know, come on bended knee and sort of, not quite be too, challenging, if you know what I mean. And I think that's the kind of devolution that they've sort of tolerated so far. I think a much more mature place to end up would be get rid of the conflict by devolving power and accountability. So leave us in the firing line, if you like, to both kind of take the powers, the funding, but also then be accountable for delivery. And Whitehall then should sort of, be able to step in if it needs to, but we don't constantly have to have this sort of bidding and toing and froing. I think if you look around the world, I think countries that have that kind of model have a more mature way of running things and a more mature democracy. And I, like you, have the zeal of the convert here. You know, I was a minister in that Whitehall system. You think it's the be-all and end-all when you're there. And, you know, it was only by talking to colleagues in local government over the years that I've really kind of begun to change my views. And coming out of government, you know, you begin to sort of see it differently. And for me, you know, I can't escape the sort of the fact that the reason England is so unequal is because of that Whitehall-centric approach, in my view, because it's over-concentrated decision makers within that one postcode, SW1A. It's led to a situation where decisions made have not been made equally in the interests of all parts of England. So if levelling up is the call, you can't level up from Whitehall. You have to put the power out as well.
Thanks, Andy. I must certainly say, as former council leaders and mayors on this panel, I don't think myself, Margaret, Dorothy or Clive have converted the other way, if that's any reassurance. And Margaret's going to ask a follow-up to the point that you've just been talking about there. Margaret, you're on mute at the moment. Still are. Still on mute, Margaret. There we go.
Sorry about that. You've very nicely led into my question, which really, having described what you have about the frustrations, how do you feel that relationship between Whitehall and the devolved authorities needs to be reformed? Because it's no good sort of just saying, oh, it could be different and we don't like it. What actually, factually, could you do to reform that relationship?
Thanks, Margaret. So I think it's about Whitehall trusting local government over a period of time with more flexible devolved funding within a sort of a broader set of outcomes that we both agree are what's trying to be achieved, and not micromanaging, not wrapping local areas up in bureaucracy. When you live in an area every day, I think by definition, you are more accountable to that area and you feel that you get the feedback from the people there, you get the pressure. Whitehall, in my view, has to accept that the closer you put decision making to where the decisions have effect, the better those decisions are likely to be. And it doesn't buy that central sort of premise yet, and it needs to, in my view. But I think it needs to move beyond, as I said, an adversarial sort of situation. It needs to be more one of each knowing what their job is and getting on with the job, and kind of having conversations where they're needed, rather than everything having to be filtered by Whitehall, which often is how it feels at the moment. I know your area. We're looking at West Yorkshire now with a combined authority and a mayoral election. I think when you start to scale up devolution, so that you will have Liverpool City Region, Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, the capability that you will build amongst those places and the sharing of knowledge, that becomes, I think, a serious, that provides a serious capability to deliver. And therefore, I think the more that we fill in the map, I think the more that Whitehall can let go and can and trust places to work together and build a delivery capability. So I do think it's about trust at the end of the day. And I think under all governments since the 80s, there's been a distrust of local government, and it needs to end. And it needs to start with a kind of new belief that if you vest decision-making in local people, because they are in those communities and feel all the pressure that comes from them, better decisions will be made than decisions made 200 miles away.
Thanks very much, Clive.
Andy, hello.
Hi, Clive.
Right, I'm going to try and ask the question that I was asked to ask with a straight face. And it wasn't whether Everton's going to win the Premier League. I'll save you
If
that
you'd asked me that 4 weeks ago, Clive, I'd have been absolutely. Less so now.
It says here, do you think there is a respect within Whitehall for devolved authorities and mayors? I suppose I might rephrase it as saying, do you think government sees yourself and other mayors now as useful as far as you go, but you shouldn't go too far?
Probably a good summary, I think, yeah. Yes, I think that's probably the, I think it's different, Clive, if I'm honest. I think different departments are coming to this at different speeds. I think some are much more supportive than others. I think the Treasury has come and gone a little bit, but I do sense that there is more support in the Treasury than people might realise, because of the potential for more efficient public service delivery when you break down those silos, when you take a more place-based approach. So I think it's mixed, if I'm being honest. I think we could have been used so much more this year, as I say, in a more localised approach to the pandemic than we actually were. But I think where we have spoken up, I think it's fair to say, I mean, you can look at Steve Rotherham and Sadiq raising the issue of face coverings very early on. Dan Jarvis has raised a number of points throughout the year that the government have taken on board, so have I. I think we've often been saying things that, and I think this is true of the devolved administrations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, we've often been first to things that the government has eventually had to come to. And I just think if they'd have used us more, put us on Cobra at the start, they probably would have had more intelligence coming through more quickly, and it probably would have led to a better response.
Can I just come back on the Treasury, because that's interesting what you say, and I think I can understand where the Treasury might be receptive to increase devolution of local authorities being able to spend money, but they really don't like the idea of local authorities being able to raise money, do they? I mean, that's the bit that they don't get at all. And I just wonder whether you got any thoughts about that and how we might challenge and tackle that, because until, in some ways your job is relatively comfortable, isn't it? Because you can spend the money you're given, but you don't have the responsibility for raising it. Is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, it is. Yes. So I do raise money. So I do raise a precept, okay. Clive. It's a relatively modest one, but I am beginning to raise money from the GM public for some of the things that we're doing here. I would turn it around with I would personally rather take more responsibility and then be held accountable. I don't fear that at all. I think the whole system works better if that's the logic of it. But I would turn it round on the Treasury when they're saying that they don't trust and therefore they don't allow local authorities to borrow. So if you take the issue of housing, which you probably know better than anybody in Parliament, as far as I recall, if the Treasury had trusted local government 20, 30 years ago to build the homes for social rent that were needed, you could argue that the housing benefit bill today would be significantly lower than it actually is. And I think that's the kind of way in which the Treasury needs to look at things. If, as well, you were to say to local government, provide the support in communities that are needed from a more fund local councils to provide the place-based, person-centric support. Again, I think you would probably find that the bill that comes with the social failure, addiction, mental health would be lower. And I think that's the way that the Treasury needs to be, needs to see this. The way we run things hasn't actually led to a particularly cost-effective way of the benefits bill hasn't come down, has it? And we haven't created the kind of efficiency in public service delivery that the Treasury is often spoken about.
Okay.
A quick supplementary from Maurice and then a main question from Susan. Maurice.
Yes, thanks, Andy and Andy. Here from Hertfordshire. I mean, look, we've all been glued to our screens, the public, in recent months. Do you think the way that COVID has played out on our screens and the challenges perhaps made by local government to central government in a very public way, do you think that could help or could actually hinder further discussions around devolution? Do you think the government will want to enter into more conversations, or perhaps just run away from it a little?
Well, it's become an issue, Maurice, hasn't it? You know, so it's interesting, isn't it? Devolution has become an issue this year. And I think it's because of, you know, the way in which the year has gone and the challenges. And I do come back to this central point that the government has taken too much upon itself and has struggled with that. And I'll give you my observation, actually, having seen in my political career 1, 2, 3, 4 prime ministers. I can't really say I've seen the current one at close quarters, but I saw the previous 4 at fairly close quarters. And what I would say is the job is becoming more and more undoable, I would say, in the modern world, because of the kind of so much is resting on the shoulders of one person. You know, it's too complex in the kind of world in which we live. And I think Whitehall needs to understand a bit more, I think, that if it was to kind of really share some of that burden with capable regional and local government, it would actually you would create a more functional Whitehall, actually, rather than the dysfunctional culture that, you know, I'm sure, you know, colleagues on this call know what I'm talking about. You know, it doesn't, you know, if you look at some of what's been going on in the centre of government recently, all that, it's too supercharged at times. You know, the temperature is too high. It doesn't function in the way that it should do. And I think that's the argument to make, rather than now this, you know, Whitehall feeling threatened because some mayors have sort of found their voice and have kind of said some things. I mean, as I was saying before, you can look back at a lot of what's been said this year, and in the end, it became what the government eventually did. So if they'd kind of worked slightly differently and had our voices in from the beginning, we were saying, use us, you know, we're here to help, you know, what can we do? I think it would have led to a better response. So you're right. I think the devolution debate is now interestingly poised. And I'm sure there'll be those voices in Whitehall saying, oh, they're just becoming a pain and, you know, get rid. But obviously for England, in terms of making England the place we want it to be, which is more equal, you know, stronger in terms of regional voice and governance, devolution is the obvious way to go now. And the big mistake would be, if levelling up is the central theme of this government, and if they're going to return to this agenda, I think I can say with a lot of experience, and Clive will back me up on this, the idea of levelling up top-down from Whitehall is doomed to fail. And I'll give you a direct example. Back in the summer, Susan will remember this, Susan Hinchcliffe, local restrictions were first implemented on Greater Manchester, parts of East Lancashire and parts of West Yorkshire. If you look at the footprint of that area, it was almost identical to the housing pathfinders of the Labour government that I was in from the early 2000s. And that was an earlier failed attempt to level up top down. And if you kind of come into communities and say, well, this is what we're doing from you from 200 miles away, lo and behold, it doesn't work. And if that isn't, and therefore 20 or so years on, those areas still had the poorest housing, still were most susceptible to this pandemic. And if we don't learn that lesson and recognise that levelling up has to be done bottom up with those communities, then I think we're going to be doomed here to repeating the cycle of failure and still end up with a very unequal, very divided, and actually quite disenfranchised England in many parts of it.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Thanks for that. Got the final question for you, Andy, from Susan. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So thank you, Andy. Nice to see you.
Hi, Susan. You too.
We've talked a little bit about Treasury and their opinion of devolution, but do you see a conflict between government departments when it comes to devolution, and how does that manifest itself?
Yes, there is a genuine difference of view, I think, Susan, between different government departments and indeed the individuals who lead those departments. What we have found is where there is an advocate coming in into a department where they're kind of, you know, they're not opposed to devolution. I'm thinking of Greg Clark when he was business secretary, and you may remember dealings with him at that time. It's really quite amazing what can happen quite quickly, and the progress that can be made when we were all signing those local industrial strategies with Greg. You know, that was impressive. Sajid, in his role at MHCLG, and even then in his time at the Treasury, you know, again, it was impressive. And I think both of those departments had a kind of willingness to go with the devolution experiment. If we contrast that with the Department for Education, I think we would all say, and you would know this too, we've never had that buy-in, therefore it's hard to characterise Whitehall as one sort of attitude to this. It does seem to differ quite considerably. But you see, my argument back to DFE would be, if in this country we had run technical education, vocational education, skills as a Rolls-Royce operation that equally supported young people growing up with those ambitions as it did young people with academic ambitions, then the DFE, I think, would have an argument to say, leave us alone, we run this fine, thank you very much, we don't need any devolution, we don't need you telling us what to do. But the truth of the matter is, over decades, under governments of all colours, the DFE has failed to create a system that gives parity to young people who want technical qualifications. And I think it does get kind of drawn up with the snobbery sometimes of Westminster and Whitehall, where most people in Parliament or in the civil service are university educated. And I think if you took responsibility for skills and technical education out of Whitehall and largely vested it in the hands of local and regional authorities, I think you would get a much more successful skills system, because they would be more connected to local economies, but actually the people running those systems would have a greater understanding of the value of technical education and skills. So that would be my answer. You know, the government departments that are resistant need to demonstrate why the status quo is better than devolution. And I think you'd be very hard pressed at the DFE end to say why their way of running skills and technical education is superior to trying something different that's more connected to local economies.
Thank you, Andy. And yeah, I mean, one of the purposes of this review is to draw out yet further away from the misconception that local government is MHCLG, when we all know it's actually pretty much every government department, probably short of the Foreign Office, actually has something to do with local government. So you've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much. If you've got any final little thoughts for us, and then we'll move on to your colleague, Alan.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your questions. And I'm really glad that the all-party group is gathering this evidence. It seems a critical time to me to be doing this. And I make the comments I make today purely in the spirit of what I think is right for the country as we go forward from here. Steve Rotherham and I decided to leave Parliament together because we kind of fallen out of love with it, really. You know, we kind of got so tired of some of its sort of London-centric ways. And the thing is, when you step outside of it, it's that ability to create a different way of doing politics that is more place-based, more unifying, and longer term. You know, the fads and fashions of Westminster are also a problem, aren't they? You know, the kind of way things chop and change all of the time. That wastes so much time and energy of people in local government. And so my observation on the last 10 years is the country's become more and more impatient with the dysfunctional kind of workings of Westminster and Whitehall. And I think I think there was original scepticism about mayors and devolution in England, but I think that is I do think in my case that is here in Greater Manchester, but I think it's true elsewhere. It's melting away a little now. People can see the benefit, and actually people are more and more saying, well, why haven't we got what they've got? And you know, that is a good thing that's beginning to build. What I do think, Andrew, is I just think it will create the conditions in communities for more engaged citizens, kind of more a sense of agency about what they can do and how they can change things for the better. I think it's the answer to a lot of what we've lived through over the last 20 years. And when you start with place, that is something that unifies people. And I think politics is healthier if you start with what unifies people rather than what divides people. So I hope that's helpful observations, and good luck in your inquiry.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a really good summation, and we'll stay with Manchester now and move on to Professor Alan Harding. And Dorothy has the first question, but before she comes in, I wonder if, Alan, you could introduce yourself and offer a few initial thoughts, and then Dorothy will come in with the first question. Alan.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alan Harding. I'm Chief Economic Advisor to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Previous to taking up that role, I spent many years, decades indeed, in academia, and I still have an academic hat to wear as a visiting professor at the Alliance Manchester Business School. So if there's anything I say in the next few minutes which doesn't seem to chime with the comments of the Mayor, then it was the professor speaking rather than the advisor. The other thing I would say to you is that we are committed to producing a written submission to this inquiry. So if there are things that you want to follow up with, or things that you want to put on my agenda today as we're discussing matters, as Andy has already said, the Greater Manchester experiment is in some senses in its early days, in its current form, but it does have a very long history, and it's a very complex beast. So in a few minutes of chatting to you, we might not get through all the details, but if there's anything you want to follow up on, then do let me know, and I can make sure it's written into our proper formal written submission to the inquiry.
Thank you. Dorothy.
Okay. Alan, Andy's last comment, which, you know, when he was talking about skills and education, just segues beautifully into mine. And I have to say, Andy, I agree with your race skills. Even the language is pejorative. I think in this country we regard vocational as somehow second class, so I'm with you with that. But Alan, you've now worked on the Combined Authority. So to what extent do you think combined authorities need more control over devolved policy areas to ensure that they have enough responsibility, you know, to actually be held accountable for the economic performance of their areas? And I was thinking particularly of skills, which I think all local government find the skills agenda very challenging, and I don't think there's been a huge load of success, or housing, which is becoming increasingly more centralised, but key to economic performance of their areas.
Yeah. I agree with both of those things, Dorothy. So if you look at the pattern whereby Greater Manchester Combined Authority has been given powers and resources, I was a fan, I have to say, of that deals process. I know it was seen differently in different parts of the country, but I think a very good starting point for inching forward the devolution movement was to start with a place, and to start with a package of resources which can then be tested and rolled out. Andy has made the case that there's no reason much of what's appeared in Greater shouldn't appear in different parts of the country. I think the advantage that Greater Manchester always had was that there is a sense of place about Greater Manchester, which doesn't have many parallels in the rest of the UK, I'd argue. Even the fact that back in 1974, the thing that was created, the Greater Manchester County Council, had the word Manchester in it, whereas West Yorkshire omitted Leeds, South Yorkshire omitted Sheffield, and so on and so forth. Just gives you an indication. So I've got a slight nuance to attach to this, in the sense that I'm absolutely with the idea that you know, devolution should be a movement, and we shouldn't think of it as an end state. But at the same time, I think we wouldn't be respecting the sort of process we've set in train unless we enable those places which have got that sense of place and that commitment and that capacity to move at their own pace. And I think that underlies much of what Greater Manchester has done. Two of the very early things that happened with the devolution deals and the city deals were in the areas that you described. So in skills, one early part of the first city deal I seem to remember was the devolution of adult skills, to the combined authority. We immediately found out within months that the adult skills budget was being cut back to a fraction of its former level. And of course, adult skills is only 18 plus, and it doesn't include 16 to 18, which is the critical juncture. You look around the world at where technical and vocational education is really done successfully, at Germany, at the Low Countries. It's 14 to 18, rather than trying to think you can pick up challenges later on. That gives you a little indication of the success of devolution. In one sense, we were able to gain useful influence over a fraction of the post-16 budget. But as you will see, we made a number of attempts to persuade the Department of Education that they should be looking at the way in which we can work together more closely on the post-16, 16 to 18-year-olds. And we have had no movement of any significance on that so far. And it seems to me that if we're ever going to tackle that problem that you're concerned about, and Andy has outlined so powerfully, then it's in that age group that we need to be concentrating our efforts. So, you know, devolution has pushed us along, and it's also come to something of a halt around an issue that is more important. On the other side of the equation, housing, we are currently going through the process, and it has been long and slow to get a spatial framework for Greater Manchester agreed. The terms on which we put it's effectively a land use and transportation plan for the future for 20 years for Greater Manchester, and it's been through a few iterations so far. That gives us a degree of latitude in terms of thinking about future housing demand and thinking about housing provision. However, the stuff that Andy has referred to, had we done it 20 years ago, things would have been different. There is no specific powers or resources in there in order to tackle issues of social housing and affordable housing. So some of the difficulties that we've had as we've tried to get agreement amongst 10 local authorities and a whole set of stakeholders around Greater Manchester in agreeing the spatial framework is we know that we're going to have to probably accommodate the population of a new borough, effectively, of Greater Manchester over the next 20 years or so. However, we don't have all of the levers and the powers to make sure that we can do stuff like tackle some of those difficult areas through powers with regard to, for example, you know, brownfield remediation, which we know we could use to make sure that we don't have to make massive incursions into Greenbelt. So in some ways, giving us the powers to do the regulation, but not giving us the powers to do something about the supply side, has meant that it's made our devolved job more difficult rather than make it more simple.
Leading nicely on to Maurice's question, I think.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you, Alan. How can arrangements be enhanced so that combined authorities that were able to take greater responsibility, if you like, for the economic outcomes in their regions?
So I think I've given you one illustration there, Clive, that, you know, we've still got some way to go in terms of education and skills. That conversation is not closed. But we couldn't honestly argue that it's come on in leaps and bounds. There's a whole set of issues around transport, which I think Andy alluded to. There is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have what we describe as a London-style transport system in Greater Manchester, which coordinates the buses, our relatively new tram system, which has been extended incrementally when resources have allowed, for 20 plus years now, and is significantly successful and popular, but is nothing like the route that we need it to be at the end of the day. So bringing those things into a single system, allowing things that you take for granted in London, such as a single ticketing system, which allows you to cross modes quite easily and get charged per day at the end of the day, signage systems, things of that sort. again, devolution has given us the option of taking forward, for example, the re-regulation of buses. It's a cumbersome system. We've got to the point where we've done all the due diligence, we've proven the case for it. It now has to go to the next stage, which is almost a quasi-legal stage of allowing bus operators to have some comeback around a system that GM wants to operate. It's taken us 4 years to get to that point. It's pretty difficult. I think we'll get there on bus regulation, but it still leaves us far short of the system which London has got, and there's absolutely no reason that we couldn't be given the powers and resources to deliver something like that. There's a whole set of things which I can send you, which we submitted through the comprehensive spending review recently, which takes some of these challenges and applies them to different areas. But in all cases, the principles are the same. We don't see any great difference between what we're trying to achieve and what national government says it's trying to achieve through its commitment to levelling up. What we need to do is work more effectively together to agree a much more flexible, place-based appraisal and framework, a pipeline of projects which will deliver something we both agree on and give us the latitude to get on and do it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Those materials will be very useful, Alan, so we'd appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. And my question is just a sort of quick question and one to give you an opportunity to do a sort of sum up of your thoughts, really, which is to say, to what extent is improved control over funding and fiscal decentralization key to the success of devolution? And if you could wrap that up with your concluding thoughts as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so one of the pleasures I had as being an academic is being able to study urban development in a whole variety of other places. And the simple answer I give you is that subnational control over funding resources is absolutely critical to getting some degree of balance, both on the people side and the places side. I'm disappointed that Lord Kerslake can't join us today, because I know he's a member of your team. Some of the work that UK 2070 did on that, comparing trajectories in Germany and in the UK, and the way in which they've crossed over. Even though Germany had to absorb the East German Länder after reunification, they have still managed to produce a more vibrant and equal country as a result of the initiatives they took. Part of the initiative they took is about national government committing to a balanced country. But part of it, I have to say, is about a constitution which the Allies, and particularly the UK bit of the Allied team, wrote for Germany, for West Germany, after the end of the Second World War. And central to that is the redistribution of resources between richer and poorer places and poorer Länder in the German context. And it's that automatic redistribution of resources that has enabled them to face some of their challenges a little bit better. We're not a federal country, but we are capable of moving towards something more like that. So is more local control over funding critical? Yes, I think it absolutely is. We've denuded our local authorities of power and responsibility over a 40-year period now, and we need to think about rolling that back. Is that achieved by fiscal devolution is a much more complicated question, because at the same time we've denuded local government of powers and resources in a general sense, we've also limited radically their ability to raise resources from local taxes. Neither of those local taxes is any longer effectively under local control, as Clive will, as probably you all know. So at the very least, restoring real degrees of control over what we already have would be a good start. But I think we'd fall into a trap. We did some work in Greater Manchester a few years ago, which looked at the fiscal gap. So do a rough calculation of how much businesses and residents of Greater Manchester could contribute to national coffers, take away the amount that is spent through public service delivery in Greater Manchester, and we calculated at that point there was something like a £7 billion gap. Now the strategy which we advertised at the time was Give us the wherewithal to close that gap, and then we can think about fiscal distribution in a more a stronger sense, confident that we'll be able to pay for our own needs, if you like. The problem we've got with fiscal distribution in the UK is there are very, very few areas that are in fiscal credit, and a lot of areas that are in fiscal deficit. So, as in all of these things, be careful what you wish for through fiscal decentralisation. Has to be a question that people like myself ask on a fairly permanent basis. But all of the international experience, to sum up, I think, suggests that if you want to achieve what the current government calls levelling up, what previous governments called rebalancing or reducing regional inequalities, it's clear that the countries that have got good indicators on two things. One is the differences between people, so income differentials. The other is the differences between places. The areas that get that right have powerfully decentralised governmental systems, but they also, I would argue, have powerful redistribution mechanisms, which makes sure that places cannot get fatally left behind in the process.
Thanks very much for those thoughts, Alan. Appreciate that. And in moving on now straight away to David Phillips at IFS, we've got very similar themes to explore and expand upon based on what you've just said. And the first question in that regard, we'll be going to Scott Mann in just a moment. But David, if you'd like to just open and offer us a few words of introduction and thoughts, and then we'll go straight into Scott's question to you, David.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me along to give evidence today. So I'm an Associate Director at the IFS, and the IFS is a research institute focused on the microeconomics of public policy. And I lead our work on devolved and local government finance. So my expertise is really around the economic and financial aspects of devolution rather than the political or institutional aspects. Although, of course, there are some sort of interactions between these different aspects of devolution, and I've thought a bit about those, such as the factors that can help inform the division of responsibilities between tier of governments. So that's sort of the background on me.
Great, thank you very much. Scott, off you go.
Thank you, Andrew. And just to build on Andrew's question to the last witness around funding and fiscal decentralisation, I'm just wondering how much you think that is the route to the success of a devolution deal, and whether you think that devolution can be effectively achieved without the majority of the fiscal support that has come about from some of these devolution deals that we've seen in other parts of the country.
Great, thank you. So I'll start by saying I think there are several factors that are important for a successful devolution. And if I had to highlight one thing as being key, it's ensuring that the funding arrangements that are put in place are consistent with the objectives and priorities you're trying to achieve. That means the level of funding, of course, but also the sources of funding and whether they are appropriate. And the arrangements for distributing funding between different areas, which Alan sort of highlighted at the end of his talk there. I think it's actually all too easy to have arrangements that are inconsistent. And I think there's a risk we've been moving in that direction in England. Our local government funding system has been moving further in the direction of reliance on how much can be raised from local sources, council tax and business rates, and to some extent fees and charges and commercial income. But at the same time, debate and policy on local services like schools and social care has emphasised consistent funding arrangements, common standards, common eligibility criteria. But how do you square unequal revenues with equal provision? And I'll come back to it in a second, but I think what Alan was saying there, that the role of fiscal equalisation, redistribution, is fundamentally important. But I think, I guess the most important thing with devolution is deciding what you think you're trying to achieve with devolution. Is it better working on the ground by leveraging local information, convening power, and economies of scope, so the interaction between different services, but you still want to have funding allocated broadly in line with needs? On the other hand, you're willing to accept divergences in funding by making funding more dependent on how much revenue is raised locally, so that areas have sort of stronger incentives to boost their economies. And do we think that areas should have the ability to decide the overall level of public service provision and taxation in their areas based on local preferences? Now, the closer you are to the first of those statements, you know, I think the less fiscal devolution is likely to make sense. The less key it is to devolution, needs-based grant funding will be more sensible. The more you agree with the latter statements about incentives and sort of local discretion, well, then fiscal devolution will be much more important. You need to provide those incentives, you need to give that local discretion with ability to set tax and spending levels. Now, there is some evidence that fiscal decentralisation is associated with better outcomes in terms of inequalities in economic output and in terms of the overall quality of service provision. The actual evidence on inequality of household incomes and inequality in public service provision, so the differences in public service provision across areas, that's actually a bit less clear-cut. And I'd probably say the evidence is actually less strong than the consensus would suggest. Because most of it relies on cross-country studies, which most economists would tell you are quite difficult to draw strong conclusions from. And it often turns on the inclusion of Scandinavia in the studies. If you drop Scandinavia, the strong results you get go away. Spain has a pretty decentralized system. It's a pretty geographically unequal country. Italy is as well. I think there's kind of three final things I would add on this kind of first question, if I could. The first is that notwithstanding some questions about the quality of the evidence, it does seem to suggest that balance matters. That outcomes are better when revenue and spending decentralisation are broadly matched, rather than going much further on one dimension than the other. And that actually there is such a thing as too much fiscal decentralisation. A lot of the graphs the OECD produces kind of show a sort of curve that it's like an optimal level of decentralisation. And actually, that optimal level depends to some extent on the degree of inequality within countries. Second, I'd echo what Alan was saying just now, that equalization arrangements really do matter. So America has very high fiscal decentralization, but it's also got terrible, unequal service provision and big geographic inequalities. That might reflect the fact that there's very little equalization. Australia, on the other hand, has high fiscal decentralisation, but actually a very equalising system of grants and transfers to even out differences in needs. And that's managed by the independent, or at least recommended by the Independent Grants Commission in Australia. So they have kind of independent bodies which suggest how much different areas need, so it's not just in the hands of politicians and the government. And in fact, Australia goes much further on this kind of redistribution than supported bastions of egalitarianism like Sweden and Finland. Sweden actually only equalizes about 2/3 of the differences in the revenues between different parts of the country. But because it's pretty geographically equal to start with, that remaining 1/3 of differences is more manageable than it would be in a more unequal place. So I think that shows, the importance of considering devolution and leveling up together. If we can really boost the economies of areas that are sort of left behind at the moment, it allows us to go further in terms of devolution, because you haven't got to be so worried then about them falling behind in terms of revenues and in terms of funding as well. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that if one does decide to pursue it, I think what taxes and powers one chooses will matter a lot. Not all taxes are born equal, and certainly not all are equally suitable for devolution. So, we've kind of seen sometimes suggestions of local corporation tax, local VATs, stamp duty. I think they're pretty poor options. We did a report back in March last year, which looked at the options, and we said that, look, if you want to devolve a substantial new source of revenue, considering a local income tax makes sense. Not instead of council tax, but in addition to council tax, that power to vary income tax as well. It's not something that we've thought about much in the UK, but actually local income tax is a pretty common feature in other countries, especially those that have got quite a lot more fiscal decentralization. I think the key benefit of it is it's a tax paid by the majority of people. It kind of gets that sort of democratic buy-in. And I think that's really important, that you have this sort of this link between the taxpayers and the local politicians that make decisions.
And Margaret's question just sort of builds upon that. So Margaret, over to you. On mute. On mute, Margaret. There we go.
I do apologise. Yes, my question then is the focus on devolving powers related to growth and infrastructure rather than social services such as welfare and health still appropriate?
I think that's a really, really interesting kind of question. And I'd probably start by kind of taking a step back and thinking about some of the principles that myself as an economist would use to kind of work out what makes things more appropriate or less appropriate to devolve. So I think that includes things like, the extent to which we think local knowledge is important for decision making, the extent to which preferences, how preferences and needs might differ across areas. Related to that, but not quite the same, is the extent to which society is willing to tolerate differences in provision. Because even if needs and preferences do differ, we might still see that we're not willing to see differences across areas. The economies of scale and scope, and the extent to which devolution may distort behaviours in ways that could be considered undesirable. So sort of encouraging beggar thy neighbour sort of competition to attract business or high net worth individuals, or to actually sometimes discourage poorer individuals from living in areas if that entails a high cost to the local taxpayer. And I think we can kind of see pros and cons of each of these for the two areas you mentioned, sort of social type services and economic development type activities. I think some factors make social services and health more appropriate for devolution, actually. We may think there's a lot of overlap with existing responsibilities like social care, like housing, like, well-being and, sport and recreation. That coordination on the ground matters a lot. I think that's one thing that I've heard people identify as being, something that's happened a lot better during the crisis, actually, is that you've seen, the crisis has been a spur to people on the ground in the health service, in the police, in councils to really get together and make decisions. That can matter a lot for things like, health and well-being. And I think, the sort of risks of behavioural distortions are probably smaller. I'm not that concerned that people are going to move across the country for, fairly modest differences in health, whereas high-income people could move around quite a lot if we devolve, the sort of powers to set, say wealth taxes in different areas. Now, I think the big factor which is pushing in the other direction, why the government isn't pushing the sort of devolution of health and social care, though, is that at least I get the sense that people are less willing to tolerate differences in provision for these kind of services than they are for things like economic development, adult skills, community facilities. I think people see things like social care, health as like citizens' rights. They're things that are kind of part of the sort of the social compact of being British. And therefore they see, differences in that across areas as being a sort of postcode lottery that's unfair. Of course, we shouldn't kid ourselves that at the moment there's no postcode lotteries. There are postcode lotteries, even with a centralised system. But I think there's a concern that you might see even bigger differences in the choices different areas are making if they had substantial devolution there. But I don't think that means that we should say, don't devolve around these areas. I actually think we can kind of see there's been different flavours of devolution. It's not just, devolution it's not a monolithic sort of idea. You can have devolution of operational decisions, devolution of policy making, devolution of funding, and there could still be opportunities to devolve more sort of operationally, what happens in health and welfare, so it can be better integrated at the local level with other services being operated locally. And I think we are seeing some of that happening. And actually, I think that's a lot of what happens in Manchester. There's still separate health and social care budgets in Manchester. They're not kind of completely pooled, but there is that sort of impetus to, work closer together on the ground. And I think there could still be, if you like, operational devolution while trying to maintain those common standards, common funding arrangements across the country as a whole.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Do you have any final thoughts for your session?
Not on this. I mean, I saw there were questions about COVID. I wasn't sure if we'd come back to those at the end or if...
Yes, we will. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. We'll do that David, so we'll remember that you're going to ask those. Say thank you very much to you for the moment then, and move straight in, not too bad for time, slipping a bit, not too bad, to our final witness, who is the chair of the Local Government Association, Councillor Jameson. We have quite a good old range of questions for you, and the first one is going to be asked by Clive, but perhaps first, James, you'd like to say a few words, and then Clive will dive in with his question. James, welcome, and over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much. And yes, I am in danger of repeating what the others say, but I think we're pretty consistent that we definitely believe that local is best. I mean, it just simply is. At the end of the day, we are trying to help a person or a place, and that is effectively a community. And you just do that so much better the closer you are to that community. And sometimes you need a scale, which means you move slightly further away. But it is just quite ridiculous. How can you affect a person through 18 Whitehall departments and actually hit them on the ground, you know, whether it's in Watford or Bradford or, you know, in Harlesden? You know, it's the person there who is closest to the situation, closest to the place, who can pull the right resources together. And it really, ultimately, when you talk about devolution and about delivering, it is how do you get that local decision-making and resource allocation to deliver the right solution. And, you know, at the moment, we're too siloed. And just to give an example that I was discussing with the Secretary of State for Health, you know, if we have somebody who is suffering from, you know, pneumonia, yes, you give them a medical treatment to overcome it, but actually wouldn't it have been so much better to give them decent housing with central heating so they didn't get it in the first place? Now, the NHS is not set up to provide decent housing, but local government is, and it's about being able to make those choices. So I think that is the key to me, and it is about devolving. And I was quite intrigued. We talk about levelling up, and we talk about moving Whitehall departments out of London. Well, actually, I think that's the wrong solution. We need to move the powers and the responsibilities out of London into the regions across the country. Much as I approve of moving some central London out of London, why not just move the powers out and give it to the local authorities? It will be far more efficient, far more effective. With the greatest of respect, you know, putting a Whitehall department in Manchester or Leeds or Newcastle, it is still a centralised service, you know, whereas if you spread it across the country, so much better.
Thank you very much for those initial thoughts, which Clive's question will build upon. Clive.
Right, James, hello, we meet again. Hi. Just to explain to everybody else, James was at the Select Committee last week giving evidence on the local government finance. So I think you've really answered the first question I was given to ask, which was make the case for greater devolution. I think we've just done that very succinctly and effectively, if I might say. Could I just come on and say the challenge that we've addressed with some of the other witnesses so far about central government handing powers down is one thing, but giving local authorities the ability to raise their own resources presents challenges both for central government, particularly the Treasury, who don't want to give their authority away, but also for local government, I think, as well. Do you want to say a little bit about that and what the LGA's position is on trying to move towards more fiscal devolution?
Well, you know, the basic principle is we do believe in fiscal devolution, and I think some of the other speakers have raised the issue of levelling up, because quite clearly, you know, some areas have more capability of raising resources and some areas actually have higher costs. So one of the biggest financial pressures on local government is adult social care. And actually that needs a fiscal solution associated with adult social care. You know, whether it's business rates or a local council tax or whatever, a demand-led service requires a solution that is, in effect, reflecting that demand level. So there are some issues around there, but quite clearly, for other services, actually a local tax or various other things would work perfectly fine. So, but the principle is, if you look at, and I think the figure is around about, for the UK, something around about 4.5% of income is raised locally, whereas the OECD average is around about 15%. That really shows that we're an outlier on local revenue. But it's not just about revenue. It is also about powers. And the previous speaker talked about the convening powers in Manchester around the health system. It's around planning powers. It's around, being able to get the public sector to work across its footprint. So if we're talking around things like adult skills and getting people into employment, that takes a whole variety of areas into account. It's not just the Department of Education and the skills, it's also DWP. It may also be some other government departments, because they might be employed in the health service, for instance. It might be the Department of Transport, because you need to transport them from A to B. And then it might be the Department of Culture, DCMS, because they might need access to broadband so they can work at times from home. So it's about the ability to pull all of those things together, as well as fiscal devolution.
Well, thank you very much.
Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Clive. Thank you, James, for that one. Dorothy, you are going to ask the next question, please, when you're not on mute. There we are.
So glad we've got you, Chair. I'm really interested in the barriers issue, James. And what's the LGA view as the main barriers that are actually serving to limit the scope and scale of place-based leadership and devolution? But the other side of the coin for me is also, how do we as local government develop greater trust with central government to break down those barriers? Because what we've heard from other witnesses is that these are largely cultural. So what does the LGA see as the barriers, and what do you feel we have to do, in a sense, to persuade our paymasters that devolution is the answer?
So I think the biggest one is cultural. It is Whitehall itself. I do understand that if a minister is at the dispatch box and being harangued for not delivering whatever it is, then they kind of want to have a lever that they can pull. They don't want to go, oh, well, that's the mayor of so-and-so's fault, why are you haranguing me? So I understand the natural instinct, but actually we should be about delivering the best for our residents. And that should be the question. And I think one of the things in local government we need to do more of is to provide the evidence and the examples. And I'm very pleased with the work that the LGA did, for instance, on public health, which was devolved. And we very clearly demonstrated that in the period that public health has been devolved, the outcomes have improved, and yet the funding for public health, as per the grant, has reduced. Now that clearly demonstrates both better value for money and improved performance. And we need to do those examples. I am also, in my LGA role, is encouraging us to be more consistent across the sector in terms of what we ask for. And this mustn't be a beggar thy neighbour policy. This must be an across the board one that provides a solution to government. And I do keep, whenever I get the chance, talking to the Chancellor, saying that we understand that fiscally it's tight. So actually what you should be doing is devolving to us, because we will do more for less, provided you actually devolve.
And remember that you have done so, because obviously the problem with public health with coronavirus is that the government seems to have forgotten that they devolved responsibilities for public health to local authorities when they were instituting their plans. But anyway, let me move on to Susan, who has the next question for you, James. Susan.
Hi, James. So a question I have a problem with it, actually. However, I'll tell you why when I've asked it. So the question is, what do you think Whitehall should do to make sure that further devolution to local authorities and combined authorities is met with the right skills and capacity at local government and at combined authority level, I've heard this question asked before, and I worry about it because it sounds like we're all stupid in local government and we haven't got the skills. And so it's always the premise of the question I always have a problem with. But you will answer it in your own way, of course.
Well, Susan, I'm in agreement with you. I genuinely think local government has a huge variety of skills and abilities to deliver things. And when we are given tough tasks, we come up to the mark more often than not. And, COVID is a classic example. We have been asked to do things like distribute business grants, and we've done it quickly, effectively, efficiently. We've been asked to do isolation payments. We've done it. We've been asked to follow up on those hard to reach tracing for COVID. And again, we're hitting 99% success rate as opposed to the sort of 70-ish% for the national system. So we are consistently asked to do things, and we achieve them. Now, if we're going to be entirely honest, with 350 councils across the country, we're not all going to be perfect, and there will be some variability. But I would argue the variability in local government is less than the variability in other parts of the public sector. In the education sector, in the health service, there is huge variability. So, we just need to make that argument that yes, we do have the skills and we will do it, and we do have the mechanisms in place to be held to account. And I would remind Whitehall, we're elected. We are held to account, forgive me, in exactly the same way that an MP is. Every 4 years, we're up for election. If we're not doing a good job, we're out.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, James. Maurice, next question, please.
Yes, thanks, James. Really good to see you. And I was just on that point about the variability. I think that as more power gets devolved down, I think we've all seen how local authorities step up to the plate. And I think we'll see more of that. Look, it does seem to be a bit them and us still. And I was hoping that with more local government people now in Parliament, it might start to change. But in the meantime, do you think there should be a more formal role for local government in the development of national policy? And how do you think this might be able to work in practice?
So, yes, and I think that would be good. And we have recently had 2 or 3 mechanisms where that's happening. The one most recently is the Brexit Delivery Board, which was originally set up by James Brokenshire when he was Secretary of State. I think that worked very well, and it highlighted issues and it moved things together. And so I think that type of board would be very useful. I would also encourage, which I'm not sure is LGA policy, but actually there should be more toing and froing at a senior officer level and the civil service. I think that would basically create better understanding at the officer level. But certainly these boards to look at specific issues, I think, are very useful and do get things moving quickly.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, James.
Thank you. So, James, my final question to you, just to you, and then we'll open it up for our final thoughts. And that is to ask a question that's been asked of other witnesses, but as someone sort of with experience on the ground, I'd be interested in your nuance upon it. And it is this: is Whitehall's current focus on devolving powers that are related to growth and infrastructure rather than social services such as welfare and health still an appropriate course of action for success in devolution?
Yeah, I think we would very much support much broader devolution. I think there's a recognition that to some extent it is easier to devolve economic powers because it is about, doing a deal. And if we give you this amount of fiscal support, what will you achieve? And in a way that's easier. Actually devolving real powers is a more difficult ask, but I think it's really important. And I think we need to move away from the whole concept of deals. We should be thinking about what can be best done locally, and actually then say, well, if that can be best done locally, how do we achieve that? And there was conversation earlier with Andy Burnham about, should we have combined authority? Should we have mayors? You know, we should be starting off with what will deliver for our residents and our place, and where is that best delivered? And if it is local, the question should be asked, how do we get that to be local? And in many instances, actually the current structures will work. You know, your classic cases, you know, if you want to devolve, for instance, speeding cars, which, you know, is a big issue. I know it's a small issue. You could use the current structures. If you're going to devolve something big, like in Manchester, devolve the health system and have it much more devolved locally, then you kind of need to think about a mayor or a growth board or something. So, you know, it is about coming up with structures that meet what you're devolving. But the default option should be, where is it best done? How do we get it there? Not about, let's think of a structure and then work out what we'll put in that structure.
Thank you very much. In thanking you, James, we'll open up to all witnesses who are still able to be with us. I know some people have had to disappear. And in doing that, I'll turn to you, Scott.
Thank you. Really interesting discussion. I'd just like to know if any of the witnesses would like to respond to any of the other witnesses' questions and documentation that they've put out there today, to see if there's any cross-referencing back across.
So, David or James, that's an opportunity for something that someone else has been asked that you thought, oh, I've got a good point to make there. Is there anything in that regard you'd like to bring up?
Sorry, go on, James.
Well, what I was going to say is I've coloured a few of my answers by previous people's responses. That's the great advantage of being last. So maybe David might want to comment on some of mine.
All I was going to say is that I think that, you know, in several kind of instances, it's been kind of emphasised that sort of context matters, that sort of arrangements that are right for certain services will not be right for others. So that includes, you know, the role of, if you like, operational devolution, policy devolution, funding devolution. The governance arrangements, as Councillor Jameson was saying there, I think can differ. So I think, you know, we almost need a root and branch, you know, review of, you know, the functions of government, the purpose of local government. And you kind of start with that root and branch review, you can actually end up with a, you know, you can't escape where we start from, but we can at least kind of go back to the drawing board and see, well, look, ideally, where would we end up?
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you. Anything else, James, there?
Well, I'm going to both agree and disagree with David. I think there's a lot you can do without huge restructuring, you know, and we should look, you know, what is it we could do without restructuring, as well as what might require restructuring. And by restructuring, I don't mean, you know, back to the 1974 Local Government Act or whatever it was. I mean, you know, local government saying, here is the question you're asking us to solve, which is often a question of how do we have accountability to central government for something that's devolved? And that doesn't necessarily have to be a mayor. There could be a local solution that works equally well. It doesn't have to be a combined authority. Those are options. What you need to do is answer the exam question. How can we provide the reassurance that we will deliver and we can be held to account for something that is being devolved?
If I wasn't clear, I wasn't saying you should, you need to do that. I was agreeing with you, Councillor Jameson.
Fine.
Great. Margaret, you have the next question.
Yes, I have. If you could make one recommendation to government that would have the most impact in relation to devolution, what would it be?
To move from the why should I to why should I not devolve?
So I guess I would say make sure that policies, structures and funding systems are aligned with objectives and expectations. That doesn't always mean you need to have changes to things, but I think, you know, sometimes we have different parts of the system pulling in different directions at the moment. I think we need to kind of get the horses all pulling in the same direction.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. And the final question for the session goes to you, Clive.
Thank you, Jameson. I was actually going to ask the question that James has just answered. You know, should we see devolution in a completely different way by not arguing what should be devolved, but should be arguing what action needs to be done at the centre, and say other things would be best down at a local level? and just turn the argument around completely. But just looking at the COVID situation, we've discussed it already. And I just wonder whether we haven't got a really good base to go out here and argue in the future for how not to do things. You know, the expertise, the knowledge, the community connections on public health issues, track and trace, all at local level. We've managed to invent an inefficient, expensive, out of touch national phone system. And I think that the classic surely has come out today when we find that lots of people's tests have been allocated to the areas where they don't live anymore, including students. And so lots of the information authorities are being given are all wrong because the individual results have been posted to the wrong areas. Now, surely we can't have a better example of how not to do it and a better example for local government to take forward to say we must be able to do it better. I don't know. That's probably a comment, but maybe just reflections on it.
So if I can give you some reassurance, Clive, we are pointing out where local government could have done it better.
Right.
Good.
I'm sure. Right.
Yes, absolutely. And that's really one of the purposes of this inquiry, which has been summed up nicely by both of you there. I wanted to keep us to time today because we've had a big session. I think we've covered a lot, and a lot which we can make use of, and certain witnesses have offered to contribute some more written evidence to the inquiry as well. So we will make use of all of that. I've mentioned the Twitter handles that people could use if they would, and I'd like to thank everybody for contributing with so many interesting points and so much time today. And I look forward to the next session when we'll continue to build upon the work we're doing in this inquiry. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank
you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Sharon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.